I never met a scholar and an academic like Joe Grodin. He just was in love with the law.
He has the human touch. He cares about people.
Joe had not just an affinity for people, but an inquiring mind. He was open to a lot of ideas. He wouldn't dismiss arguments right away.
He was a wonderful example of what a progressive, public-spirited lawyer should be.
And he's held true to the ideals he started with. Today, he remains committed to the interests of working people.
From age 5, we lived in Piedmont, which was an all-white, almost all Gentile community. And growing up in that community with pervasive anti-Semitism that I experienced in the schools, particularly the high school, I came to understand what it was like to be an outsider. In my junior year, I went abroad to Boy Scout Jamboree. And to get there, we crossed the country by train through the South. It was my first experience with segregation and racism. So that had an effect on me. I think I developed a sensitivity to people who were outsiders, to people who were discriminated against. Before going to law school, I met a friend of the family, Matthew Tubriner, who was a labor lawyer in San Francisco. And then after graduation, he offered me a job at $300 a month, which I accepted immediately, although it was $50 a month less than my secretary was receiving. I thought I would practice for a few years. That ended up being 17.
Because of the pressure that was generated by the farm worker movement, especially the boycott, everyone, including the growers and the governor and the union, wanted to see some resolution to the conflict. That's why Jerry Brown took it upon himself that we had to have a law in California that set the ground rules to develop this process of unionization for farm workers.
I had been with California Rural Legal Assistance for 4 years. Very often our lawsuits were against state agencies that weren't enforcing the law. So to have a new law that permitted the farm workers to organize themselves and therefore speak for themselves was vitally important.
The ALRA, the Agricultural Labor Relations Act, was a brand new law that gave farm workers, for the first time in California history, the right and the protection to organize and belong to a union and bargain collectively with their employers, in this case, the California growers.
There had been lots of turmoil in the fields, and part of the purpose of the act was to bring peace and stability to the fields by the rule of law. It was the first and still the only act in the entire country to provide a mechanism for elections somewhat parallel to the National Labor Relations Board.
Jerry Brown was looking for somebody who understood labor law, who understood the administrative process, who had high intelligence, who wasn't encumbered with a lot of baggage that would offend either farmers or growers. So Joe was a natural candidate. When the governor's office called him to offer him the position and tell him the governor wanted to appoint him, we couldn't find him.
My wife and I went up to British Columbia for a backpacking trip, which we'd like to do. And as I checked in, there was a message for me that I was to call a Jerry Brown, or if I couldn't get him, then a Tony Klein.
Well, he tried the governor, couldn't get him, so he called me, and I conveyed to him what the story was.
And he said that the governor wanted to ask me to be on the Agricultural Labor Relations Board.
And so he eventually agreed that he would take the job. He wanted the one-year position with an opportunity to return to Hastings, and that's what happened.
Joe was the intellectual leader of the 5-member board. He was the one of all the board members who knew labor law.
I have to say that Joe was He was a godsend, really.
We were the first labor board in the country that had anything to do with agricultural labor. We had rule-making power, and we proceeded to hold hearings and make rules. And much of what we did was innovative. For example, we adopted a rule allowing union representatives and organizers to go on the field to organize employees because that's the only way they could reach them. And that was pretty unheard of in the private sector.
Starting in May, June, July, August, through the harvest season, more than 50,000 farm workers, imagine that, voted in secret ballot elections under the jurisdiction of the Agricultural Labor Relations Board. Now, in just a few short months that we were able to get that far and get that much done is incredible.
Farm workers, by joining unions, could be heard, and they could be a participant along with employers in the formation of terms and conditions of employment in the fields. It meant a great deal to farm workers to do that, and it meant a great deal to me to be able to participate in that. I went back to teaching. In a couple of years, there were openings on the Court of Appeal. Then Justice Tubriner, who was my constant mentor, called to say, well, maybe that was something that I should be interested in doing.
And again, we called Joe, and this time he wasn't hiking, this time he was river rafting.
Janet and I were on a boat trip down the Grand Canyon.
He wasn't there at the hotel or motel, and he had to call the governor. If he couldn't reach the governor, call me. It was an old story by now.
I later learned that Tony had talked to our daughter, who was then 15 or 16, and he told her that he was trying to find me to make sure that I would accept a nomination to the Court of Appeal. And Lisa said, oh, yes, he will.
He kept his chamber's door open, and he would walk the halls. And if you happened to be walking the halls too, he didn't care if you worked for another justice. He wanted to hear your ideas. It was very flattering, actually.
There were judges that one could talk to, and also very bright people, some of whom went on to become judges themselves. And so that was always very gratifying to be able to talk about these issues. It was a good thing to do. It broadened my experience. It enabled me to make some contribution to the process. And maybe it made me more acceptable for consideration for promotion to the Supreme Court.
They didn't have a problem with Joe being AWOL when it came to the Supreme Court, I can tell you that. I think Joe knew that he was one of the finalists for that position.
This time, we were in a Chinese restaurant, and I got a fortune cookie that had two fortunes in it. And one of them said, you're about to get good news, and the other one said, you're about to be promoted. And the next morning, I got a call from the governor. Most of the cases the Supreme Court hears are quite significant in terms of their impact, not just on the case you were deciding, but on future cases for a long time. And that creates a different atmosphere. There's a sense of responsibility about that. Well, we had a diverse court with respect to gender and ethnicity. To have people in the room with you who have experiences that you haven't had broadens your own thinking, inevitably. I think it has a very important effect on the process.
Justices all have different personalities, but his was so outgoing and continues to be to this day. And that would elevate the mood of the court.
When I was on the Supreme Court, I became aware that there were cases that could be decided under either the California Constitution or the federal Constitution involving liberties and rights. And I became an advocate for the idea that whenever there is a constitutional issue involved, the court should look first to the state constitution. And only if it decides that the interest that is being asserted is not protected by the California Constitution, only then should it look to the federal Constitution. The California Supreme Court's decision in the same-sex marriage case was based exclusively on the California Constitution.
Joe has been a leader in a lot of intellectual discussions about the law. But sometimes he wouldn't be writing an opinion, he'd be working on a guidebook for trails in the Sierras.
That's one of the things that I've written that I know some people have actually read.
People versus Lanphier, People versus Green, People versus Thompson, People versus Jackson. 37 death penalty verdicts overturned so far. How many more to go?
Governor Deukmejian was asked after he had declared his opposition to Rose Bird on the retention election how he felt about Justice Reynoso and myself. And his response was he would wait and see how we decided cases, particularly death penalty cases. But I just continued to work, and it seemed like the threat against me was minimal. But there came a time when the forces that were allied against Rose Bird decided that they had a real opportunity to create not just one, but 3 vacancies on the court for the governor to fill. And then they went after us seriously.
On Election Day, cast 3 votes for the death penalty. Vote no on Rose Bird, Cruz Reynoso, and Joseph Grodin.
So it was clear to us well before the election that those who were opposed to the Supreme Court, insurance and other moneyed interests, had not liked what the Supreme Court had been doing for many, many years.
My advisors kept advising me that I had nothing to worry about, and that turned out in the end not to be true.
I was in this building when the results came back of that election. I think everyone was stunned. I felt personally that this building should have been wrapped in black bunting.
It was just so painful. You knew he was going to be able to carry on with his life, but you know, the chance to really shape the law of California, that was over.
We never took it personally. In fact, I think I may have been quoted at that time. If I believed what people were saying about me, I'd vote against me.
I knew that I had done the job as best I knew how, and I had no regrets about any of my decisions.
He did leave a wonderful legacy, most of which I think still hold firm as precedent.
Though he ended up serving less long than perhaps some would have expected, it worked out perfectly for the school, because then he came back.
I love the teaching process because I love to see students' minds expand and grapple with new ideas. It constantly requires me to rethink my own ideas, so I'm learning along with the students.
I started with one class. I took a labor law class. I think it was labor and employment. And after that, I took every other class he offered.
People would pick a class such as Joe Grodin's labor law class, and then suddenly law would make sense. It would come to life because now you're talking about an actual individual human being with a problem.
Joe was the principal advocate at Hastings who promoted the clinic. Joe had the vision to know that experiential learning was going to be an important component for law students. The Workers' Rights Clinic is basically a collaboration between Hastings and the Employment Law Center. And what it's designed to do is provide basic legal advice and information to low-wage workers. Hastings proved to be sort of the pilot program for us, from which we then adapted all of these other programs using Hastings as the core model.
Hastings is a unique place in its proximity to courts and administrative agencies. As the idea of what constitutes a legal education has broadened, students become law clerks at courts. They go to hear oral arguments in the Supreme Court and the Ninth Circuit, and it's just a great opportunity to be part of an active legal community.
Joe Grodin was instrumental in transforming UC Hastings. He was once one of the youngest faculty members at UC Hastings. He is now one of the oldest faculty members. But what runs throughout those decades of teaching is the love for the law, the love for students, the desire to ensure that he passes to the next generation how to advocate for the ordinary person.
He really brought out my interest in being an employment lawyer and the reality of it and my passion for it. And I was hooked.
Hi there, how are you? Fine, how about yourself? Great. When I go around and students come up to me and say, I was in your class and thank you so much and you've had an impact on my legal career, it's very gratifying.
Every year, we do a set of banners to promote the school, and they hang both around campus and throughout the city of San Francisco. We only feature about a half dozen people. This year, Joe Grodin is one of them. For us to put Joe Grodin on a banner says to the world, this is the spirit of UC Hastings. It is a progressive spirit. It is about students and humanity. And it's about making the world a better place.